This is Walter Bosley. I'll be reading a selection from The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, the CIA and Mind Control, the story of the agency's secret efforts to control human behavior, by John Marks. In June 1964, MK-Ultra became MK-Search. Dr. Gottlieb acknowledged that security did not require transferring all the surviving MK-Ultra subprojects over to MK-Search. He moved 18 subprojects back into regular agency funding channels, including ones dealing with the sneezing powders, stink bombs, and other so-called harassment substances. TSS officials had encouraged the development of these as a way to make a target physically uncomfortable and hence to cause short-range changes in his behavior. Other MK-Ultra subprojects dealt with ways to maximize stress on whole societies. Just as Gittinger's personality assessment system provided a psychological roadmap for exploiting an individual's weaknesses, CIA destabilization plans provided guidelines for destroying the internal integrity of target nations, like Castro's Cuba or Allende's Chile. Control, whether of individuals or entire nations, has been the agency's main business, and TSS officials supplied tools for the macro as well as the micro attacks. For example, under MK-Ultra subproject number 143, the agency gave Dr. Edward Bennett of the University of Houston about $20,000 a year to develop bacteria to sabotage petroleum products. Bennett found a substance that, when added to oil, fouled or destroyed any engine into which it was poured. CIA operators used exactly this kind of product in 1967 when they sent a sabotage team made up of Cuban exiles into France to pollute a shipment of lubricants bound for Cuba. The idea was that the tainted oil would grind out motors and cause breakdowns, says an agency man directly involved. This operation, which succeeded, was part of a worldwide CIA effort that lasted through the 1960s and into the 1970s to destroy the Cuban economy. Agency officials reasoned, at least in the first years, that it would be easier to overthrow Castro if Cubans could be made unhappy with their standard of living. "We wanted to keep bread out of the stores so people were hungry," says the CIA man who was assigned to anti-Castro operations. "We wanted to keep rationing in effect and keep leather out so people got only one pair of shoes every 18 months. Leaving this broader sort of program out of the new structure, Gottlieb regrouped the most sensitive behavioral activities under the MK Search umbrella. He chose to continue 7 projects, and the ones he picked give a good indication of those parts of MK-Ultra that Gottlieb considered important enough to save. These included none of the sociological studies nor the search for a truth drug. Gottlieb put the emphasis on chemical and biological substances, not because he thought these could be used to turn men into robots, but because he valued them for their predictable ability to disorient, discredit, injure, or kill people. He kept active 2 private labs to produce such substances, funded consultants who had secured ways to test them and ready access to subjects, and maintained a funding conduit to pass money on to those other contractors. Here are the 7 surviving MK Search subprojects. First on the TSS list was the Safe House program for drug testing run by George White and others in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Even in 1964, Gottlieb and Helms had not given up hope that unwitting experiments could be resumed, and the agency paid out $30,000 that year to keep the safe houses open. In the meantime, something was going on at the pad, or at least George White kept on sending the CIA vouchers for unorthodox expenses, $1,100 worth in February 1965 alone under the old euphemism for prostitutes, aka undercover agents for operations. What White was doing with or to these agents cannot be said, but he kept the San Francisco operation active right up until the time it finally closed in June of that year. Gottlieb did not give up on the New York Safe House until the following year. MK Search subproject number 2 involved continuing a $150,000 a year contract with a Baltimore biological laboratory. This lab, run by at least one former CIA germ expert, gave TSS a quick delivery capability to meet anticipated future operational needs, as they put it, according to an agency document. Among other things, it provided a private place for large-scale production of microorganisms. The agency was paying the Army Biological Laboratory at Fort Detrick about $100,000 a year for the same services. With its more complete facilities, Fort Detrick could be used to create and package more esoteric bacteria, but Gottlieb seems to have kept the Baltimore facility going in order to have a way of producing biological weapons without the Army's germ warriors knowing about it. This secrecy within secrecy was not unusual when TSS men were dealing with subjects as sensitive as infecting targets with diseases. Except on the most general level, no written records were kept on the subject. Whenever an operational unit in the agency tasked TSS about obtaining a biological weapon, Gottlieb or his aides automatically turned down the request, unless the head of clandestine services had given his prior approval. Gottlieb handled these operational needs personally, and during the early 1960s, when CIA assassination attempts probably were at their peak, even Gottlieb's boss, the TSS chief, was not told what was happening. With his biological arsenal assured, Gottlieb also secured his chemical flank in MK Search. Another subproject continued a relationship set up in 1959 with a prominent industrialist who headed a complex of companies, including one that custom manufactured rare chemicals for pharmaceutical producers. This man, whom on several occasions CIA officials gave $100 bills to pay for his products, was able to perform specific lab jobs for the agency without consulting with his board of directors. In 1960, he supplied the agency with 3 kilos, or 6.6 pounds, of a deadly carbamate, the same poison OSS's Stanley Lovell tried to use against Hitler. This company president also was useful to the agency because he was a ready source of information on what was going on in the chemical world. The chemical services he offered, coupled with his biological counterpart, gave the CIA the means to wage instant chemical and biological attacks, a capability that was frequently used, judging by the large numbers of receipts and invoices that the CIA released under the Freedom of Information Act. With new chemicals and drugs constantly coming to their attention through their continuing relations with the major pharmaceutical companies, TSS officials needed places to test them, particularly after the safe houses closed. Dr. James Hamilton, the San Francisco psychiatrist who worked with George White in the original OSS marijuana days, provided a way. He became MK Search subproject number 3. Hamilton had joined MK Ultra in its earliest days and had been used as a West Coast supervisor for Gottlieb and Company. Hamilton was one of the renaissance men of the program, working on everything from psychochemicals to kinky sex to carbon dioxide inhalation. By the early 1960s, he had arranged to get access to prisoners at the California Medical Facility at Vacaville. Hamilton worked through a nonprofit research institute connected to the facility to carry out, as a document puts it, clinical testing of behavioral control materials on inmates. Hamilton's job was to provide answers to specific questions and solutions to specific problems of direct interest to the agency. In a 6-month span in 1967 and 68, the psychiatrist spent over $10,000 in CIA funds simply to pay volunteers, which at normal rates meant he experimented on between 400 to 1,000 inmates in that time period alone. Another MK Search sub-project provided $20,000 to $25,000 a year to Dr. Carl Pfeiffer. Pfeiffer's agency connection went back to 1951 when he headed the pharmacology department at the University of Illinois Medical School. He then moved to Emory University and tested LSD and other drugs on inmates of the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. From there, he moved to New Jersey, where he continued drug experiments on the prisoners at the Bordentown Reformatory. An internationally known pharmacologist, Pfeiffer provided the MK Search program with data on the preparation, use, and effect of drugs. He was readily available if Gottlieb or a colleague wanted a study made of the properties of a particular substance, and like most of TSS's contractors, he was also an intelligence source. Pfeiffer was useful in this last capacity during the latter part of the 1960s because he had sat on the Food and Drug Administration Committee that allocated LSD for scientific research in the United States. By this time, LSD was so widely available on the black market that the federal government had replaced the CIA's informal controls of the 1950s with laws and procedures forbidding all but the most strictly regulated research. With Pfeiffer on the governing committee, the CIA could keep up its traditional role of monitoring above-ground LSD experimentation around the United States. To cover some of the more exotic behavioral fields, another MK Search program continued TSS's relationship with Dr. Maitland Baldwin, the brain surgeon at the National Institutes of Health, who had been so willing in 1955 to perform terminal experiments in sensory deprivation for Morse Allen and the Artichoke program. After Allen was pushed aside by the men from MKUltra, the new TSS team hired Baldwin as a consultant. According to one of them, he was full of bright ideas on how to control behavior, but they were wary of him because he was such an eager beaver with an obvious streak of craziness, as they put it. Under TSS auspices, Baldwin performed lobotomies on apes and then put these simian subjects into sensory deprivation, presumably in the same box he had built himself at NIH, and then had to repair after a desperate soldier kicked his way out. There is no information available on whether Baldwin extended this work to humans, although he did discuss with an outside consultant how lobotomized patients reacted to prolonged isolation. Like Hamilton, Baldwin was a jack of all trades who in one experiment beamed radio frequency energy directly at the brain of a chimpanzee, and in another cut off one monkey's head and tried to transplant it to the decapitated body of another monkey. Baldwin used $250 in agency money to buy his own electroshock machine, and he did some kind of unspecified work at a TSS safe house that caused the CIA to shell out $1,450 to renovate and repair the place. The last MK Search subproject covered the work of Dr. Charles Geschichter, who served TSS both as a researcher and funding conduit. CIA documents show that Geschichter tested powerful drugs on mental defectives and terminal cancer patients, apparently at the Georgetown University Hospital in Washington. In all, the agency put $655,000 into Geschichter's research on knockout drugs, stress-producing chemicals, and mind-altering substances. Nevertheless, the doctor's principal service to TSS officials seems to have been putting his family foundation at the disposal of the CIA, both to channel funds and to serve as a source of cover to agency operators. About $2.1 million flowed through this tightly controlled foundation to other researchers. Under MK Search, Geschichter continued to provide TSS with a means to assess drugs rapidly, and he branched out into trying to knock out monkeys with radar waves to the head, a technique which worked but risked frying vital parts of the brain. The Geschichter Fund for Medical Research remained available as a conduit until 1967. As a part of the effort to keep finding new substances to test within MK Search, agency officials continued their search for magic mushrooms, leaves, roots, and barks. In 1966, with considerable CIA backing, J.C. King, the former head of the agency's Western Hemisphere division, who was eased out after the Bay of Pigs, formed an ostensibly private firm called Amazon Natural Drug Company. King, who loved to float down jungle rivers on the deck of his houseboat with a glass of scotch in hand, searched the backwaters of South America for plants of interest to the agency and or medical science. To do the work, he hired men and women of the Amazon, plus at least 2 CIA paramilitary operators who worked out of offices located in the Amazon, specifically in Iquitos, Peru. They shipped back to the United States finds that included Condodendron toxicophorum, a paralytic agent which is absolutely lethal in high doses, according to Dr. Timothy Plowman, a Harvard botanist who, like most of the staff, was unwitting of the CIA involvement. Another plant that was collected and grown by employees in the Amazon was the hallucinogen known as yage, which author William Burroughs has described as the final fix. MK Search went on through the 1960s and early 1970s, but with a steadily decreasing budget. This is Walter Bosley, and I've just read a selection from The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marks.